Chair this final session of what I think has been a really wonderful afternoon. And so this final session, I'd like to introduce Professor Terry O'Connor, who is one of the founding members of Forced Entertainment. I went to their website and found out that this was, I quote, a 30-year collaboration reinventing theatre to speak about the times we are living in, inspiring audiences across the UK, in Europe and further afield. Terry has worked within and beyond the Academy and has been forging some very exciting new collaborations here at Sheffield, linking between practice-based research and pedagogy. She's going to present a screening from their complete works, Tabletop, Shakespeare. I think we're going to introduce it a bit first, and then we'll have the screening. So
Thank you very much, and thanks Rachel and everybody for inviting me today. So this is going to be quite an informal introduction, more of a kind of preamble to a performance than a paper, but it is something that I've begun to work on. And I suppose I should say that I'm talking to you here today, well, kind of as an artist and also as a researcher. So just to tell you a little bit about Forced Entertainment. Forced Entertainment has been making performance in different forms for over 30 years, and although the company has always been based here in Sheffield, the work now tours predominantly in continental Europe. One might say it's part of an area of performance work that is marginalised by certain agencies of theatre culture and reception here in the UK, but not, say, in Germany or Belgium or Switzerland. We work as an ensemble, and our work has always been experimental, looking for a performative game or conceit rather than a dramatic scenario, placing the audience in a situation where engagement with the event is a process of negotiation rather than transmission. In this, we've always seen ourselves borrowing as much from art and music and performance art as from the tradition of playwriting fostered in the UK. We have never really done plays. In Europe, this does not play to so much of a cultural divide, and drama and the post-dramatic, as Hans T. Slayman named theatre outside of plays in 2006, can more easily share the same venues and programmes, despite their differences in form. This means that the definitive boundaries of the two areas of work are more porous, blurred, and the aesthetics inform one another. In the UK, although the Academy is consistently interested in the aesthetics and relationality of the post-dramatic, theatrical cultural industry largely sidelines it, eschewing eventful mimesis, the visual for the literacy, and the performative for the dramatic. But we have perhaps, Forced Entertainment, perhaps chosen this marginal space too, preferring the creative agency it allows, working independently as an experimental company, able to determine and to discover the work project by project. So our work has included pieces of long duration, say lasting up to 24 hours, where the audience is free to come and go. It's sometimes been improvised and based on a set of rules that are left to run uniquely for each occasion, sometimes created for spaces outside of theatres. And if all of this sounds inherently marginal in form, the question behind it is maybe not. Formal questions about the relationship between event and audience, about structuring the time of performative experience, and about the potential languages of performance have been a catalyst for each piece. Each new piece an encounter with that empty space, and an open question about what to do in it. Throughout the work, there's also been a focus on the provisionality of utterance. So texts in our work and in other examples of the post-dramatic tend not to occupy a dominant stage position, nor are they dialogue of characters observed from the unacknowledged distance of the auditorium. More often, text may use a direct address to the audience, or they may be based on a game played before an audience that is acknowledged and complicit. Within these frameworks, the words that are spoken are not the distilled mode of communication that they might be in a play. They are attempts. If, as in one of our works, a performer attempts to tell you the story of the Big Bang, they will perform the task as a layperson, an everyman, and the telling will be subjected to interruption, to confusion, to repetition, to abandonment. The text is not permitted its usual dominance or clarity. Text becomes texture. Moreover, the texts that we create are often the result of improvisation, if not actually improvised in front of the audience. The utterance seems to have the status of the best that can be done right now, for you, here, rather than a fixed and efficacious fundamental. Our approach to text might be described as seeking ways to sidestep or to avoid the authority of onstage speech. So speech tasks or speech games may be rendered impossible or difficult, with as much time spent thinking or qualifying as declaring. And perhaps this approach to a provisional stage utterance extends the game out to an audience. What would you say in my place? Is this right? Is this all right? Are you with me? These questions are foregrounded. As they are now. Turn over page. These questions are foregrounded. Comedy. Manner with pieces of paper. As a provisional utterance, as important a part of the negotiated present as any official content. I'll do that sentence again. These questions are foregrounded in the provisional utterance and become as important a part of the negotiated present as any official content. So, we found ourselves working on the complete works of Shakespeare, more or less. We only actually do 36 of the plays last year, but after a suitably roundabout journey. More than 10 years ago, we tried to put a version of King Lear together as a work in progress after 5 days' work. As part of the rehearsal for this, Tim, the artistic director, asked his brother Mark, then working as a fish farmer, to join us, and he asked him to read the play on the train up from Devon. Later that evening, after some drinking, Tim asked Mark what he could remember of the plot, having never read it before, and he filmed him retelling it for almost half an hour. So the retelling was rough, and it was broken with remembering, and it was full of Mark as much as Shakespeare, but it was beautiful in its relation to the original, and returned to a kind of oral tradition of sorts. It was also a marginal, provisional take on a great centralised object within the culture. Whatever Mark got right or wrong in his telling, he evoked a particular relation to the original, and for the spectator, the original as well as the telling is summoned. Some years later, after months of experimenting and refining, 6 members of the company now have versions, more or less, of 6 of the plays each. I say more or less because the text remains provisional, unfixed. People might have homemade revision cards to study on the day of the performance, but it would be impossible and arguably counterproductive to know in advance exactly how the words are going to come out. Most of us know the shapes of the scenes and the shape of the plot, but the utterance is negotiated live in relation to the moment, the audience, and the objects on the table. The basic setup that you're going to see is the same for each of the plays, but the objects on the table will be different for each. A performer sits at the table and tells the plot of the play, using everyday objects to represent the characters. Each performer chose the cast objects carefully. There are different approaches for different plays. Some are based on type of object. Some are based on colour or size, or individual elements of casting might have a particular metonymy. Romeo is a torch. I chose it because of references to light and love in the play. But the nurse is a bottle of Dettol because it was obvious. Whether live or live streamed, this recording is of the live streaming from Berlin. What you're witnessing is a very ordinary act. It looks a bit like the marking out of positions in a pub account of a football match, or a child's battle with Playmobil versus Pokemon. The placing of the objects is itself a provisional attempt to understand, as well as to account for, how the fiction might have been. Both performer and audience place themselves in a reflective relation to the play as object. The bottles and containers and household objects you will see standing in for the loved and contested and culturally central characters of the play may be said to be vaguely anthropomorphic. Some have what you can see as heads and shoulders. But there is an obvious inadequacy of representation. They are inanimate. They don't live. They don't even move. They are everyday, low-value objects. We may be so familiar with them that we don't really see them anymore. And we are invited in the audience to imaginatively make these vessels live and love and doubt and die. Perhaps this inadequacy foregrounds a question about all interpretation of a role. How much is any theatrical interpretation of the text a reduction of its possibilities? Looking at objects and imagining them as people places the imaginative task as a responsive act repeatedly undertaken by the audience. In The Emancipated Spectator, Jacques Rancière challenges formal divisions between active and passive theatre and proposes that the theatre should be considered a site of active participation for the audience, even when that participation is just watching and listening, because watching and listening can involve imaginative remaking. And I quote, "Theatre should call for spectators who are active interpreters, who render their own translation, who appropriate the story for themselves." And there is need of that interpretation here to make the inanimate live. A space, perhaps, filled with memories of the scene as you've once seen it in the theatre, or the original text as you might recall it through the paraphrase. The game creates a doubling of the event as the inadequacy of the task prompts recollection of other interpretations. The bottle is not Hamlet, but the inadequate standing in allows the audience to imagine their Hamlet, or to remember a series of very different Hamlets, or to keep Hamlet as a textual cluster of ambiguous, infinite possibility. In 1910, Edward Gordon Craig, the actor and designer, put forward the argument that Shakespeare is unstageable and should only be read. Craig suggested that the acted Hamlet kills some of the infinite wealth of the imaginary Hamlet. So notions of marginality and provisionality are central to this project, Complete Works. What we realised as we started to work on this retelling was that this approach sidestepped the more usual frameworks for critical and theatrical attention, which often concerns Shakespeare's themes, or Shakespeare's language, or Shakespeare's characters. This was a work based on the dynamics of plot. For some critics, this is theatrically wrong-headed. Michael Coveney responded in this way in The Telegraph in March of this year. Tabletop Shakespeare sounds like a feast. this is more of a famine. But for us, there is a beauty to the mechanics of plot laid bare in this way, and to the focus on dramaturgy, on what goes where in the story. In a way, this has been the purest piece of practice research I've ever undertaken. It doesn't attempt to replace the original, but to approach it and to understand it from a different perspective. Perhaps this is one example of how the marginal space occupied by artists can reveal the world and its cultural objects from the side, and in so doing ask how we position ourselves now in relation to a text that is so well known and so contested and so unknown still. Thank you. I should say that we're going to start at the beginning of Hamlet, but we're not going to get to the end. So I'll try to find a suitable point. So I know that wine over there in the corner is calling. I think the volume should be okay. Are we going to open up to questions?
I think we should. I just think, to Terry, first of all, that I wanted it to carry on. Everybody else did. I was really enjoying that, and I thought what you were saying, we've heard a lot about kind of marginal bodies, marginal identities, and marginal spaces, and I think everything you were saying just reflected in really interesting ways with that. So thank you to Terry, first of all. Now for questions for Terry, but also I don't know any sort of broader reflections from the afternoon as well.
That was great. Can I ask a bit about, did you have a sort of principle of inclusion that you were trying to work towards, if you see what I mean? Was there a sense that I'm going to keep that, right? Because it seemed to be, as far as I could tell, you were following it scene by scene. There wasn't a sense of cutting scenes from it. Obviously, you were keeping to the, there were particular phrases that your diction was clearly following. I guess, what was the sort of conscious process of selection that went into?
That's a crucial question, Tom, and it was the thing that because if you imagine that we had to do 6 plays each, it was the constant sort of question really, and I have to admit that my methodology was slightly different for each one. So for Hamlet, because I know it well and I love it and I know it through its verse and its language, it was impossible to lose that. And it also, and this is possibly true for Richard II as well, which is another one of mine, so much of what happens is through the ideas and through the expression of the soliloquies, for example, the thoughts, that I kept it quite close to the language when I could, fast enough to paraphrase when I could. It's you can see that I say there, oh my prophetic soul or something. Occasionally let myself actually just directly quote, but that's also a little bit of a game really, like saying the nut of a shell, the shell of a nut rather than the nutshell. Just sort of finding ways of dipping in and out of the actual language. So that's what I did with Hamlet. I was absolutely strict about the scene order. I was also really strict about, hang on a minute, when Gertrude first comes on in the text, when do we find out that that woman who's come on, the Queen, is Hamlet's mother, for example. So there's all sorts of things that you can say when you're plonking your object down. You could say, this is Othello and he's got a jealous streak. or you could sort of look at where that major kind of implication actually comes out through the text. So I tried to stay with how the text revealed information where possible. Now, I also do the Merry Wives of Windsor, and I was saying earlier that I just cut 50% of it. And I didn't have the same reference. I cut the subplot because I couldn't get my head around it, I couldn't understand it, and it seemed turgid. I really wanted to concentrate on full stop and the women. And for that, the approach was quite different because it didn't really seem like the verse needed quite so much. Well, actually, it's the thing about efficiency. The verse here is actually really efficient at communicating the ideas quite often. And in the Merry Wives, it seemed like it was more about, and full stop goes into the corner and gets into the close of the fact aunt. And it's more like a farce, and you really just want to try and make it as comic as it possibly can be here. So a mixture, different plays, slightly different approaches. But the other thing to say is that each of us worked alone. It was the most solitary kind of devising and rehearsing period that we've ever gone through. And different people had really different approaches. But absolutely, that question of how much to stick to the shape of the dramaturgy was really crucial.
When you do a comedy like Merry Wives of Windsor, do you pick objects which are comedic themselves in any way?
Well, full stop, we got really criticised in the press for being sizist. Because full stop was a massive brandy bucket. Again, it was a bit like the bottle of Dettol for the nurse. It just immediately seemed intuitively right. So it wasn't so much a matter of trying to find something that's funny. It's just, we had loads and loads of objects to start with in the rehearsal room. And there was a bit of a scrabble where people were saying, I want this for Henry IV, and then somebody else would say, no, you can't have that, that's my mistress, quickly. But I did notice, I hadn't even really clocked this, although I must have, but the women in the Merry Wives are honeypots. Two different Waitrose and Waitrose and Tesco's kind of plastic honey things. So I'm not even sure if I was aware of the kind of innuendo and euphemism in that. But I also noticed that I chose really brightly coloured jars of sweets for the two women, Adriana and Luciana, in the Comedy of Errors, and it took me ages to realise that the women were like things that were good to eat. Because Mistress Quickly is also a bag of sugar. And in fact, Juliet is a jar of Rose's lime marmalade. So, kind of in and out, really, I think. You're kind of looking for ways for the object to both fit and not fit. We noticed as well that everybody was following a convention whereby the servant or the ambassadors or the messengers or the courtiers would always be little objects. So there was always a kind of convention of size. And that we kind of reasoned that was saying to the audience, you don't have to worry too much about this object.
I want to ask, with the Marginal style, did you find that people were coming along to see plays with people? Did you think attracting more people who maybe were a bit put off by Shakespeare in traditional light setting, or did you find that there was also people who knew Shakespeare well and wanted to see how much in this different style it kind of worked?
Well, thanks for that as well, that question. I mean, it opened in Berlin, and it was really difficult to tell in advance how it was going to fit with the German audience. No subtitles. but Robin, who lives in Berlin, who's part of the company, assured us that people knew their Shakespeare, and it was quite late at night in Berlin, so we didn't get a very young audience, as in not many children. But when we did it in the Barbican in March, we did get a lot of kids, so we got some people who presumably, for whom this was their first encounter, or one of the first encounters with Shakespeare. I'd say for forced entertainment, this has been a kind of significant way of tapping into a different audience, because there were definitely people at the Barbican that were coming because it was part of the Shakespeare festival. And some of the press, like the Michael Coveney, was not good, and some of it was. So I don't know if I can generalise really about whether people who knew their Shakespeare liked it more or less than people who didn't know their Shakespeare. But I do know that a lot of people thought it was a good way to get to know some of the plays that they didn't know before, that they hadn't read or they hadn't seen.
I was watching online. I watched Pericles being straight from Berlin, and I've watched several things that Forced Entertainment have live streamed now. Not all, Quizula and Tomorrow's Beat, not all of it. I did stay up for 12 hours, and I really liked it. I found it totally compelling. But one of the things I noticed was this sort of this virtual audience that you're reaching now, and I wondered if you had any reflections on that, and also the way that the audience, particularly tomorrow, I think I'm getting right, Tomorrow's Beat. Is that when people confess at the
Speak Bitterness.
Speak Bitterness, sorry. That performance, the way that there's a sort of online social media audience that were also confessing. Any thoughts on that sort of ephemeral audience?
The live streaming has been a real kind of formal extension of the work, and in a way that was made as a discovery. I think Speak Bitterness was the first one that we screened it a while back, and we noticed that people were beginning to tweet their favourite confessions and then add their own confessions. And then we did a 24-hour Quizula, and Quizula is it's a long performance. The audience is free to come and go. In this case it was 24 hours. And it's questions, which are mostly set, but not all. Some of them are improvised, and answers, which are all improvised. And what we started to notice back that happened there was that people were watching, they were sending in questions. Somebody in the office was kind of compiling the questions off the tweets and feeding them back into the performance. So it feels like super for being able to do that loop in a way that sort of just doesn't happen live in our experience. I mean, I think other people are also doing great things with the live streaming. So there's a Station House opera performance at the moment that's called At Home in Gaza in London, and it works with superimposing a domestic situation in London, a domestic situation in Gaza. So people are finding ways for the live streaming to really cross obvious geographical and political boundaries. But it does. It's a combination of the streaming and the tweeting means that the circle can be kind of complete, which is really, really exciting. It kind of adds to the nervousness, I think, because you're going out, and that in Berlin there were maybe 40 or 50 people there, so it's kind of informal, and it's meant to be low key, really. Like it would work very well in a space like this, but then at the back you've got the equivalent of Jamie's camera there. You kind of know that loads and loads of people are watching it, yeah. But we got great screen grabs as part of this, as part of the Shakespeare, like a little kid, a 4-year-old watching on a laptop going, "Cool, Dad, look at Bolingbroke's army." As all these bottles were lined up on the table. So yes, it's and I'm sure there's a lot more that's going to develop really in terms of performance and streaming. as a kind of formal possibility.
Got time maybe for one more question? Rachel?
I really love your image of the actors, the players as empty vessels, glasses. And it's so interesting the way characters within a play can be extracted and turned into images of themselves. Hamlet, the bottle of vinegar and so on. That's not really my question, that's just an aside. My question is, that idea of the actor as an empty vessel, is that something you use in your teachings? Is that a kind of thing that is part of being a theatre practitioner?
I think the transparency is an interesting idea, which is perhaps not the emptiness. But although the style of performance that we quite often work with is not so much about adopting a character, but more working with a version of yourself, the version that emerges in relation to a task, for example. Quite often we try to adopt some aspect of that transparency. So there might be an idea that you would, I don't know, copy or take from the way that somebody else would do that job. So it's not as though you're adopting their character, but it's as though you kind of thinking about the self as an infinite range of possibilities and versions. And maybe the transparent vessel does something to sort of suggest that. But that's definitely at the heart of all of our work, I think, this idea that this approach to performance which kicks out the linearity of characterization and the fixity of it and allows performers to jump from discourse to discourse, a text and way of being to another text and way of being, is actually a kind of quite passionate philosophical principle about how people are made and how we make ourselves and the open possibilities for that.
Thank you. Can we have one final thank you for a wonderful way to end the day?